Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming. And I'm going to talk about my work on sovereign debt, both theoretical and empirical, but fairly concisely, hopefully, so not to bore you. And I draw very much on my joint work with Jeremy Bulow, who's here, and Carmen Reinhardt, who's not, both of whom influenced me enormously. Before I launch into my talk, I just thought I would pick up on one point from Mark Flandreau's talk. He gave a talk about economic history and how no one pays attention to economic history. And I have to say, I was we have coffee with our graduate students once a week, and we just hang out. It's informal. And I was there, it was maybe 7 months ago, with a couple of the graduate students who are, I might add, very top students in our program at Harvard. And they were saying nice things about my book with Carmen Reinhardt, This Time is Different, and how interesting it was and how it influenced them. And then one of them said, now that you've finished this, are you going to go back to doing research? And I think it, gives you an idea of the, mentality of the profession that, we slaved on it for 7 years. And we had thought we were doing research, but it doesn't have a lot of mathematics or technical material in it. So I guess maybe it doesn't qualify. One of the things you'll hear from many people talking about the current wave of the financial crisis is that certain levels of debt are absolutely unsustainable, certain levels of debt are sustainable. The Germans and the IMF will say Greece just needs to be tough, they'll pay their debt. Other people will say this is ridiculous, they obviously won't. What do we actually know about that? I mean, what do we base these comments on? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory of sovereign debt, which has some perspective about that, and also what it has to say about the empirics of it, which are can be very much not on the same wavelength. First of all, before I start, here's a graph from my book with Carmen, with just a little bit of notation added to it. And this is a figure giving what percent of the world weighted by GDP is in default at any point in time. And I realize it's not very easy to see even from, on a large screen. It goes back to 1800, which is where we start this. We go back further than that, but that's where this graph starts. And it goes through 2009. And of course, one thing you might notice is there's a huge wave of defaults around the Great Depression and World War II. These are what percent of the world is in default. It reached nearly 40%. There are other waves. The Napoleonic Wars had quite a few defaults. And in fact, we have it representing only 15% of GDP because we're using Angus Madison's measures of the size of the world, which would weight Asia at a very high back in 1800 because so many countries were on subsistence and they have a lot of people. But a big part of Europe was in default, which by many measures was a big part of the financial world at that point. And then there's a wave of defaults after the Latin American countries become free. Greece, Spain default a lot in this period, Portugal. But if you look at the recent period, there's hardly anyone in default at the moment. In fact, I think Ecuador is in default, but they have plenty of money, but they take pride in having never fully paid a bond since World War II, and don't want to break their record. But one of the predictions that Carmen and I have in our book is that when you have a wave of international banking crises, then there can follow very often, within a few years, a wave of sovereign defaults on external debt. And we actually have a paper that's just come out in the American Economic Review with a title something along these lines that goes into much more statistical detail and analytical detail than we have an opportunity to do in the book, underscoring what a frequent phenomenon that is. Now, if you listen to many European leaders or you read research papers that the IMF has been turning out, you will hear that there might be defaults again, but they won't be in Europe because the defaults don't happen in advanced countries. There was the IMF senior staff had a paper that they were going around the meetings a year ago. They're having them again now, the IMF World Bank meetings. A year ago, they had a paper they were going around with, which was titled something along the lines, "Advanced Countries Never Default." And they treat Greece as an advanced country, and that was an implication that it would never default. And it is true if you look at external debt. This is from another paper of mine with Carmen. It's not from the book, and Rong Kian, that was in the Macroeconomic Annual. And this looks at how long it's been, going back to 1800, since countries were last in default. And there's a slight difference with France and Sweden defaulted in the Napoleonic Wars. So they're not quite as long. And some countries go all the way back to their independence. Canada hasn't had a default, although Newfoundland defaulted and such. Now, if you look towards the bottom of the table, certainly Greece doesn't look quite as good. It only cleaned up its last default in the 1860s. And one of the wonderful facts that Carmen and I have in the book, it's on page 99, is what percent of years different countries have been in default. And Greece has actually been in default every other year since it achieved independence. So it was certainly with amusement that we read this paper saying how Greece could never default, and that was absolutely impossible and was something unthinkable. And before I turn a little bit more to the theoretical side, which I want to come to, I will say that some of the reason that you get this big wave of defaults after a wave of deep financial crises is that growth does not quickly return to what it started at. That has been a very powerful message of my work with Reinhardt, that after banking crises, growth is very, very slow to recover. And yet, if you look at the policies in the United States, in Europe, elsewhere, but I'm going to focus especially on Europe, the policies were all predicated on that things would get much better, and if you could just put off the problem for a while, that was the right thing to do. Then you wouldn't have to worry about it. And Reinhardt and I call the current episode not a great recession, which we think is a name that doesn't really describe what we're seeing. We call the recent financial crisis the second great contraction. And this is tipping our hats to Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, whose book on the Great Depression was called The Great Contraction. And we view what we're experiencing as not as deep, but very, very much along the lines of what was experienced after the Great Depression. And I think one of the problems, not just with forecasting, but with policy, it's been built on the idea that we're in a great recession. That's been the name. And that carries the idea that we may have gone down a lot, but we're going to go up very fast. When in fact, after a deep financial crisis, when there's a big overhang of public and private debt, that's simply not the norm. In fact, we look at dozens of episodes and find that that's not what typically happens. You don't necessarily go into recession for 2 decades, as Japan virtually has, but that it's a very, very slow recovery. And so these policies of sort of providing a little money, well, I should say providing a lot of money for a while and trying to keep things going, don't necessarily work. So what do we know about why countries repay their debts? And this is a little embarrassing to show you because it's going to tell you we don't know very much, but I'll show you what we know. We do have models, and we teach them. I have them in my book with Maury Obsfeld, and we teach them to our graduate students, which emphasize a few different reasons why countries would repay their debt. So one reason is because they want to borrow again in the future, and if they don't repay their debt, that could destroy their reputation as a good borrower and might make it hard to borrow in the future. Now, I want to be careful to say, why are we talking about reputation? Because the whole problem in international lending, one of the things that is fundamentally different from domestic markets, is that there isn't an enforcement mechanism. There has been discussion of a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, and Krieger, the deputy managing director after Stan Fisher at the IMF, proposed such a mechanism. People have proposed international bankruptcy courts. There's not. There isn't an international law. And so some people have sort of reacted and said, well, let's try to think about how this could work if there was no rules and no law. Could debt be self-enforcing? And economists have come up with these rather clever models where if you don't repay, it undermines your reputation in the future for repaying, and that gives you some incentive to repay. And the classic paper on this is by John Eden and Mark Gersowitz, written almost, I guess, 30 years ago at this point. We'll revisit that, but there turn out to be certain fragilities in this approach. We'll come back to it. A second approach is to assume that although there's not much you can do to a country that doesn't repay its debt, it's an exaggeration to say that there's nothing. And in particular, most modern trade depends on trade financing and trade credits. And the fact that you're vulnerable in the international banking system when you're in default gives creditors the opportunity to interfere with your trade. And you can't necessarily be forced to repay a lot because they're interfering with your trade, but nevertheless that poses important problems. And I should say that Jeffrey Sachs and Daniel Cohen and other researchers had explored aspects of that before we did. We extended it in a number of directions, but that's a literature which implicitly assumes there are some legal rights, not many, not within the creditor country, but outside the creditor country. And the fact that the creditor country, one way or another, needs to dip its toe into international waters periodically presents a problem. And then I would say there's a third strand, which Jeremy Bulow and I introduce in our early work on this, but it's been expanded a lot by Hal Cole and Patrick Keogh, that says you just can't look at this in isolation. It isn't like you just don't lose your reputation for repaying debt when you lose your reputation. It's much broader than that. It can interfere with trade negotiations, conceivably foreign policy, conceivably something much greater. So there's a very interesting intellectual debate around this about which the right approach is. And I will say that the Eaton and Gersowitz approach is the simplest to use. And I think by and large favored by theorists for two reasons. One, it's just very simple because you don't have to introduce any other extraneous parameters from outside the model. And also, it doesn't require you to know anything about institutions or laws. You just need to know what the economic incentives are. And if we theorists find anything attractive, it's not having to know anything about institutions. And so this is certainly very, very popular. But there really are a lot of question marks around whether it's logically coherent. And I won't get into it. There's interesting debates. But all of these, certainly the first two, have one common theme, which is if this is the reason you're repaying, to maintain your reputation for repayment or to avoid legal obstacles abroad, you're not going to be willing to pay very much. And I remember working with Jeremy early on when we were first starting to look at data, which we did in our work in the mid-'80s, and Jeremy's pouring through, figuring out, wait a second, let's not look at how much money was loaned to Argentina. That's meaningless. Let's look at the difference between what they were loaned and what they paid. Let's look at the net flows. Which way is the money flowing? And he observed that over the data that we were looking, you never saw countries repay very much for very long. It was very, very hard to find episodes where when you looked at the net flows, when you calculated out those numbers, it was more than a few percent of GDP. We were just talking, Jeremy and I were just talking before this, and observing that if you look closely at Greece, it's still getting money. So it's sort of a unique situation where it's not a question of how much you're going to make it repay, but how much are you going to pay Greece so that it doesn't default on the debt it owes you. That's the situation there. But if you try to calibrate these models, and it's very, very difficult to do, you simply do not come up with big numbers. You come up with numbers, whether you look at it the Eden-Gersowitz way or you look at the trade exclusion way, it's very, very hard to get that you're willing to pay a lot for very long. So this is a table from my book with another co-author, Maury Obsfeld, where we implement the Eden-Gersowitz. We do a parameterization of it. This is an academic conference, but I will not try to show you the models. It's very beautiful, I think, variation of a Lucas model. It's very pretty, but gives a very clean and elegant way to do the calculation. And here we look at different countries and their growth rate in the first column. The second column is the volatility of their output. That's a big variable in how much you're willing to repay, because if you have a very volatile output, you want to stay connected to international capital markets. You might need them. So you're willing to repay more because it could get really bad in the future, and you want to retain that correction. So the columns to focus on, though, are the two middle columns. The total cost that of being excluded from capital markets relative to a year's income is the third column. And you see, and I will only say that we chose parameters to try to get a high number. Argentina is willing to pay a third of a year's income. That's not in a year, that's forever. That's all. It'll make a payment equal to a third of a year's income in order to retain access to capital markets. Brazil, you see 24%, 53%. So, wrap your heads around that. How big can a debt get? Well, empirically, it is actually, for most emerging markets, very rare to see the external debt get much beyond 40 to 60% of GDP, which is consistent with these numbers. I have to say, if we chose a different rate at which the government discounts the future, we modeled the governments as kind of patient in this. But of course, in the real world, they typically often don't care very much about what happens 5 years later, as long as they have, their money, their own personal money, parked safely abroad. It's hard. It's really hard with the Eden-Gersowitz to get a big number, and there are lots of technical issues, but you can look at our book. It's hard to get a big number. If you do the cost per year of what is the country willing to pay per year, then you're seeing the fourth column, and they're numbers like 2%, 0.5%. So our models don't necessarily mean anything. Okay, they're just models. But if you look at some of, say, the IMF programs as they were imagined for some of the periphery countries, and look at what the planned payments are going way out, you're going to see numbers like 4 and 5% per year for a very long time. They're very inconsistent with these theoretical calculations. We could. So it's telling you when your debt gets up to over 100% of GDP, by theory or an outlier. What about by empirics? So this is from chapter 2 of my book with Carmen. It looks at middle-income countries, emerging markets. What is the level of their external debt to GDP the day they default? How big does it get? And what it's saying is that the first column's what your debt to GDP ratio is, and the second column's the frequency. So a little over 19% default at debt GDP ratios just under 20%. At the 41 to 60%, you're getting another 32%. So what it means is half of all the defaults occur at debt to GDP ratios under 60%. And there are some cases where somebody gets above 100% in defaults. It has happened. But all of these calculations that we see, not just by the theoretical calculations, but also looking at the historical experience, suggest that these are very large numbers. Now, there are some things missing in these calculations, and I mentioned that when I'm trying to calibrate the model, I'm looking at these two classic approaches, the one which looks at reputation for future borrowing, the other looks at direct interference with trade. There is this other channel where somehow it's broader in the relationship, and I think we don't understand that. It's much more open-ended. I certainly can imagine for Greece or for Portugal, they might be willing to pay more because they're part of a European Union that can punish them more if they're willing to. It's not clear that that's credible, by the way, for Europe to say that, but potentially one could extract something more. Now, from the table I just gave, there is a piece missing, and again, referring to Mark Flandreau's comments, that piece is that I was just looking at external debt, and sometimes domestic debt can be very important. That's something I think that was not well understood prior to my work with Carmen. I certainly didn't understand it. And that was, and I don't think Carmen did, and that was in part because you couldn't get the data. That if you wanted to get the data on how much, say, Brazil owed in around its 1982 default, what was public debt? So in the United States, that's, say, $14 trillion at the moment and rising, but that's what public debt is. What was the number for Brazil? What was it for Spain around their 1977 default, much less going back further? You actually couldn't get that data. That might sound nuts, like you have to be kidding. It's hard to wrap your head around that fact, that you can't get that data. You're telling me that governments don't make it easy to find out how much they owed in the past. But yes, that's correct, and I was pretty sure about it because Carmen and I first started working on this when I was chief economist at the IMF and director of the research department. She was deputy there, and we had really all the resources of the world at our fingertips. We had all the resources of the IMF, the World Bank. We could go talk to the national authorities, and there was nothing. We ended up negotiating with national authorities, calling in favors and such in order to get 10 years for maybe a dozen countries that we were able to get the data, and that was it. I find this kind of interesting. You see all the complaints by the governments pounding their fist about everything the banking system did. Why didn't we know about the off-balance sheet liabilities? Why didn't we know what you owed? You go try to find out what governments owe, and it's actually not very easy. They're all the contingent liabilities. And if you want to go back 5 or 10 years, try to find out what they owed, because you need to. If you're an economist, you have to be able to calibrate. What's a big debt? What's a small debt? How do you think about it? It didn't exist. And just to make a long story short, we found the data. Carmen was working in the basement of the Federal Reserve. which he had special permission to use because her husband at the time, still her husband, Vincent Reinhardt, but at the time, he's now chief economist at Morgan Stanley, but he was chief economist at the Federal Reserve, that she got permission, and she had some dusty old League of Nations volume, that's the precursor to the United Nations, and she was looking up looking up trade data, and came across some debt data from, I think, 1927 or something like that, and that just helped provide us the blueprint of how to find a lot more of it. And we were able to put together a number of tables like this one, which looked at, if you put together total debt during an external default, you do see a number that's significantly larger. So yellow is the external debt over revenue. Here it's divided by revenue, and blue is looking at the total debt, which takes into account the domestic debt. Now, I have to say, when Jeremy and I were working on the theory side of this, we didn't see much domestic debt because they didn't report the data, so how would we know what was there? But we sort of had the idea, well, what does it really matter? They're just going to default on the domestic debt holders. Nobody cares about the domestic debt holders. And I think what Carmen and I found as we explored this more is that's empirically an exaggeration. I don't think we're at the other extreme, which some theorists assume. There's a series of very interesting papers by Fernando Broner and Jaume Ventura, which assume that countries honor domestic debt religiously, but they don't necessarily honor the foreign debt and the interplay. It's very interesting, but empirically not very relevant. But we do find, Carmen and I do find, that it's not so clear that the domestic debtors get dumped on quite the way you'd imagine. And our work is at a very early level on looking at domestic defaults. But we do find that when you look at the total debt owed, it's a little less weird that the countries are defaulting. I remember when